I'm about to reveal the bloody and mysterious history of vampires, those who cannot die, and why they need a constant supply of human blood. By the end of this film, you'll be an expert on vampires, so keep watching. Unless, of course, you're of a gentle disposition, in which case, turn away now. Hello and welcome to my crypt. I'm Tony McMahon, an investigative historian. You've probably seen me on a few TV documentaries, but enough of that. You've probably heard of Dracula, but he's a newcomer to the vampire fold. Vampires have been appearing in mythologies around the world for thousands of years. They appear in different guises as Strigoi, Moroi, Dhampir, Upir and Baital, but they all have one thing in common. They're not alive and they want to drink your blood. So join me then as we go back over the centuries to meet our ancestors who drove stakes through the chests of their relatives to stop them coming back from the dead. We'll meet an Eastern European ruler, Vlad the Impaler, who may have been the model for Dracula. And we'll also encounter an 18th century vampire pandemic that swept across Eastern Europe, in particular in Greece and Hungary. And stick around because we're going to look at how Hollywood monetized ancient vampire myths. And also I'm going to be posing an unexpected question. Was Dracula Irish? Remember to subscribe if you want more of this horrific content, and of course, like, comment and share. Belief in vampires over the last 100 years has been so strong that several high-profile murder cases have involved people who genuinely believed that they were vampires. In California in 1938, 21-year-old Rodney Gregg, a railroad worker, is charged with the murder of Leonie Vlucht. He stabbed her multiple times in the chest, and there are marks on her throat forming an equilateral triangle. What puzzles forensics is that there's no blood around the wounds, but journalists soon jump to their own conclusions, and he's dubbed a vampire killer. In England in 1949, John George Haigh is found guilty of multiple murders. He's disposed of the bodies in an acid bath. Now, he's often referred to as the acid bath murderer. However, he also confessed to having drunk the blood of his victims before he disposed of them, and was often referred to as a vampire killer at the time. In 1924, the so-called Vampire of Hanover is put on trial. Friedrich Hamann confesses to the murder of 24 young men and boys. Another vampire killer, he demands to be beheaded, which was still a form of capital punishment at the time in Germany. The judge gave him his wish, and on the 15th of April 1925, his head flew off his body. So let's go on a hunt for vampires down the centuries, but before that, remember to subscribe. Thank you very much in advance. Our hunt for the first mention of vampires starts in ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago. A queen of Libya, a beautiful woman by all accounts, falls in love with the king of the gods, Zeus. But the queen of the gods, Hera, isn't taking this lying down, and she condemns this woman to be a demon, half snake, half human. Hera also kills all of the queen's children, and grief-stricken and furious, she goes about the night in demon form, killing, murdering and eating other people's children. Fast forward 1500 years to the English medieval village of Warren Percy, and things are not as idyllic as they seem. The villagers are going to the cemetery and they are attacking the bones of their own dead, their own relatives. In recent years, the skeletons have yielded up their secrets. 137 skeletons show signs of knife marks. 10 bodies were beheaded or dismembered after death. Warren Percy was eventually deserted along with hundreds of other medieval villages. Why? Were they fleeing vampires? 5 years ago in the northern Polish town of Bydgoszcz, pardon the pronunciation, I don't speak Polish, archaeologists found that the villagers had placed a farmyard sickle across the neck of a dead woman in the 17th century. They did the same to another woman, but across her pelvis. What was it that these villagers were trying to stop? Were they terrified of revenants, of people coming back from the graves? Belief in vampirism was always very strong in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's a part of the world where Christianity came late. And the Christian church told people that cremating the dead was no longer on. You had to bury your dead, because of course they had to rise bodily on Judgment Day. But villagers were terrified that their dead would rise a lot sooner than that. In Slavic cultures, there was tremendous fear of vampires, of the dead coming back to haunt the living and to infect them with vampirism. The only solution was to reopen the grave, to drive a stake through the chest, to decapitate the body, and to then burn it. Maybe what should have happened in the first place. On to Transylvania then, or more accurately, the kingdom next door, Wallachia, where in the 15th century a tyrannical ruler called Vlad the Impaler was terrorizing his people and all his enemies. Now, some believe that he was the model for Dracula, though Bram Stoker never actually mentions him by name. His signature punishment for anybody who crossed his path was to have them impaled, and then he'd have a nice meal while he watched his enemies dying in agony. Vlad was assailed on all sides by Hungarians, Turks and other enemies, and his cruelty reached such a pitch that stories even got back to Pope Pius II, who no doubt clutched his pearls and his crucifix in dread terror. Vlad the Impaler has popped up in the movies, for example in the 2014 movie Dracula Untold. In order to rescue his own people, to stop them being invaded by Turkish armies, he visits an ancient vampire in a cave who's been there apparently since the fall of the Roman Empire. This old vampire tells him that in order to rescue his people, he has to become a vampire, and in order to do that, he has to drink some of the old vampire's blood. Well, he does it, he becomes a vampire, he slaughters an entire Turkish army, he even turns into a flock of bats. But he's also been informed that in order to become a human again, he mustn't drink human blood for 3 days. Well, he's a vampire, and that proves to be impossible. So faced with an eternity of being a vampire, well, he just goes ahead and infects his entire army. Another variation on the Vlad the Impaler story is in the 1992 film Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. And in this film, Vlad comes back from campaigning against the Turks. He's been victorious, only his wife has committed suicide because she thought he was dead. Email hadn't been invented then, remember. Now Vlad is then told by a priest that because his wife has committed suicide, she has committed a mortal sin, and her soul will not go to heaven because suicide is forbidden by the Christian church. Well, Vlad is enraged. He rejects God, he curses God, and he thrusts his sword into the stone cross above the altar, which then oozes blood. He drinks the blood, he becomes a vampire. There was a lot of blood in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and some believe that the movie was playing on fears around contaminated blood during the AIDS epidemic which was raging at that time. In the 16th century, Central and Eastern Europe was obsessed by the idea of a creature called the strigoi, a type of vampire. And the master of TV and movie horror, Guillermo del Toro, took this idea with his multi-season TV series, The Strain. New York is taken over by zombie vampires, and they infect humans with parasitic worms delivered at the end of huge stinger tongues that fly out of their face. Pretty gross. The first recorded case of a strigoi was a man called Juro Grande in the town of Istria in modern Croatia. He terrorized his own village, after he died of course, for 16 years. He returned to his wife and raped her over and over again as he was decomposing. I mean, imagine how horrific that was. Eventually a priest led a mob to his grave. They tried to stake him, but the stake flew off his chest. So eventually they just decapitated him, and that worked. If you've been suitably horrified so far, do remember to like the video. As I said at the beginning, vampires are called different things in different cultures. So in Southeast Europe, in the Balkans, you have the Dampir. Now they're half human, half vampire. They can eat normal food, but they get maximum strength from human blood. And then in Romanian mythology, we have the Moroi, a dreaded form of vampire. All of these types of vampire, the Strigoi, the Dampir and the Moroi, all turn up in the Vampire Academy series of novels turned into a TV series. Now the way it works in that TV series is that the Dampir protect the Moroi from the Strigoi. All very complicated. Now I want to jump back 400 years to meet a woman called Countess Báthory in what is now Slovakia, and she was accused of murdering hundreds of villagers and bathing in their blood in order to keep young. She was eventually walled up in her own castle, and it took her 3 years to die. In 1971, Hammer Horror made a movie that was based on her life, only audiences weren't going to know who Countess Báthory was, so she was renamed as Countess Dracula. Now, if you've got any comments or contributions to make on what you've heard so far, go down to the comments below and air your views. And coming up, we're going to be looking at the Dracula novel and the lead up to Bram Stoker's classic. What were the influences on him at the time? In the 18th century, we have the so-called Enlightenment, where science and reason are pushing back against religion and superstition. Two Frenchmen decide to investigate vampires in the spirit of the age. One of them is a scientist, the other a monk. Both of them come to surprising conclusions. Joseph Piton de Tournefort is a French botanist who travels around Europe to study plants, but somehow ends up studying vampires. In Greece, he discovers that a murdered peasant has been clambering out of his grave every night to strike terror into the village. The villagers rip his heart out, but he comes back again. Then they burn him, and that solves the problem. The second inquiring mind from France is a Benedictine monk called Antoine Calmet, and he discovers a vampire pandemic that sweeps Eastern Europe between 1727 and 1735, centering on Serbia and Hungary. And graves are opened in front of medical experts, and the bodies have florid complexions. Their nails are still growing, and there is blood all over their chest and abdomen. The same century, the 18th century, saw the emergence of the Gothic horror novel, and this was pioneered by authors who loved that sense of mystery in the past, the macabre, the supernatural. One of the leading lights of this movement was Horace Walpole, who wrote an excellent Gothic novel called The Castle of Otranto. He also built a mansion in southwest London, which is still there today, a real Gothic set piece, and I got married there this year. A contemporary of Horace Walpole was the German author Gottfried August Burger, and he wrote a novel called Lenore, which was going to be very influential on those writing about vampires. In it, Lenore, the female protagonist, has an argument with God because William, her fiancé, her betrothed, has died in battle. She's really annoyed with God and demands the return of William. God's annoyed with her for daring to question his judgment, but William is sent back to her, and the two of them ride through the night on horseback, only they end up at a cemetery where William reveals himself to actually be death, and he takes her soul, because you don't cross swords with God. The prototype for Dracula emerges 70 years before Bram Stoker, a character called Lord Ruthven, and he is the baddie in a play called The Vampire. Now, who wrote that play is a bit of a mystery because it goes under the name of both Dr. Polidori and Lord Byron. Now, these two gentlemen had been friends, though they fell out after a particularly raucous party in Switzerland involving a lot of drink and drugs. Also at this party was Mary Shelley and her husband Percy Shelley. After the party, and it must have been quite a party, Mary Shelley went on to write the novel Frankenstein. Out of that same party came the play The Vampire. Now, Lord Byron denied he had anything to do with it. Polidori took all the credit. But the main character, Lord Ruthven, in some ways bears a certain resemblance to Byron. He has no morals, and after all, Byron in real life got his own half-sister pregnant. The story of the vampire is pretty straightforward. This character, Lord Ruthven, goes on a trip around Europe with a wide-eyed innocent friend called Aubrey, but the two of them are set upon by bandits, and Lord Ruthven is mortally wounded. As he lies on his deathbed, he says to Aubrey, "Don't ever tell anybody my name, and don't mention the fact that I'm dead." Aubrey finds this a rather weird request, but he returns to London. But then imagine his surprise when he finds Lord Ruthven walking around on the streets of London and not dead at all. It becomes clear that something has happened to Lord Ruthven, and what terrifies Aubrey is that Ruthven declares that he's going to marry Aubrey's sister. Now, Aubrey tries to warn his sister, but then dies mysteriously. Ruthven marries Aubrey's sister and then drains her of all her blood on the wedding night. If that name Ruthven seems familiar to any of you comic book geeks, it's because a character called Baron or Dr. Ruthven popped up in vintage Superman comics many decades ago and almost turns Superman into a vampire, though Superman manages to impale Ruthven on a sword that's being held by a statue. Now, something quite unexpected happens to the whole vampire scene in the 19th century. It basically emigrates to Ireland. At the same time that Byron or Polidori is writing the vampire play, a Protestant cleric called Charles Robert Maturin is also writing a vampire story well received at the time, but now pretty much forgotten. Decades later, another Irish writer, Sheridan Le Fanu, writes a vampire novel about a lesbian vampire called Carmilla. And what's astonishing is that this book is published in 1872, so much for the prudish Victorians. In 2020, Carmilla was made into a pretty good movie with strong female parts, and that was in marked contrast to another version of Carmilla made in 1970, something called The Vampire Lovers, where the roles of the female vampires was very much downgraded and they were directed by men, very much in keeping with the misogyny of the 1970s. In fact, throughout the 1970s, the lesbian vampire became a kind of staple of soft porn movies. So we get, for example, Werewolf Meets Vampire Woman in 1971. Yes, the movie really was called that. Now, another Irish writer who produces a play about vampires is Dionysius Bukiko, mercifully Dion for short. He writes a play called The Vampire, which when it goes to the US is called The Phantom. Well known at the time, now largely forgotten, but it came out 40 years before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. Okay, so now step forward Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. Who was Bram Stoker? He was the business manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London. He was a friend of Oscar Wilde. He was the agent of a very high-profile actor, Henry Irving, and he visited the White House on a couple of occasions, meeting President William McKinley, who would be assassinated in 1901, and also President Teddy Roosevelt. But he's famous above all else for writing Dracula. Okay, let's slam through the Bram Stoker Dracula plot. It centres at first on Jonathan Harker, a young, gullible lawyer who goes to Transylvania to complete a real estate deal that involves Count Dracula. He must visit the Count's castle in Transylvania. But when he gets there, the villagers all say to him, "Don't go up there. Don't go to that castle." Now, of course, Harker doesn't listen. This is a horror story after all. He gets into the carriage sent to him by Dracula. Along the way, it's attacked by wolves, and yet when they get to the castle, Dracula is able to just shoo the wolves away, and they do his bidding. Dracula in the Bram Stoker story is a mustachioed, elderly and polite gentleman. Nevertheless, Harker soon realises that he is the prisoner of Dracula. Dracula has a small harem of female vampires who make a beeline for Jonathan Harker, not surprisingly maybe, but Dracula is most insistent that Harker is for him and himself alone, and orders his female vampires away. Back in England, Mina Murray is Harker's fiancée. She's waiting for his return. In the meantime, she's hanging out with her slightly badly behaved friend Lucy. Mina visits Lucy at the northern town of Whitby, where there has been a shipwreck on the coast. Strange to say that nobody has been found alive on this ship. In fact, nobody's been found at all. And a dog was seen bounding off the ship at the last minute. In its hold are 50 cases of earth. Lucy starts sleepwalking, and Mina follows her into a cemetery where a strange figure approaches and envelops Lucy. She then becomes desperately ill, and there are strange puncture marks on her throat. A family friend runs the local psychiatric asylum, Dr. Seward. It's not exactly a modern asylum, it's very Victorian. And basically he gets somebody he knows, a great scientific authority called Van Helsing, to come and investigate the mystery of Lucy. Van Helsing has a theory about what's happened, and he has garlic placed all around Lucy's room. Now a strange wolf gets into the house and kills Lucy. Jonathan Harker has now escaped Dracula's castle and ends up in the city of Budapest, where Mina goes out to meet him. Van Helsing, meanwhile, is trying to convince everybody that Lucy has become a vampire. Nobody is buying this until they see the dead Lucy eating a baby. Well, that's quite convincing. Undead Lucy is staked through the heart, decapitated, and her mouth is stuffed with garlic. Well, that seems to deal with her. Mina and Harker are back in England. Van Helsing tells everybody they've got to contaminate those boxes of earth with Christian holy water and communion wafers, all that kind of thing. And they all decide to hole up in Dr. Seward's asylum. Big mistake. Dracula makes his way to the asylum, and he meets there a loyal servant, one of the inmates, called Renfield. He also, while he's there, manages to sink his teeth into Mina, thereby contaminating her so that she will become one of his kind. However, the boxes of earth are now contaminated, so Dracula must flee back to Transylvania. Now everybody else follows him. They get to the castle first, they slay the female vampires, and Harker stabs Dracula to death. The plot of Bram Stoker's Dracula has been well and truly messed around with over the years by the movies. Let's take the example of the character Renfield. In the 1922 silent movie Nosferatu, Renfield becomes Harker's employer. In the 1931 Dracula movie with Bela Lugosi, it's Renfield that's sent to Transylvania to do the real estate deal and not Harker, falling under Dracula's spell, of course. In the 1970 movie Dracula, Renfield is a mute. In the 1992 movie Bram Stoker's Dracula, Renfield was the real estate agent handling Dracula's affairs before Harker. In the 2017 animation Monster Family, Renfield is Dracula's butler, who then turns on his master. And in the 2020 BBC Dracula adaptation, Renfield becomes Dracula's 21st century lawyer. Now, a useless fact, but clinical vampirism, that is when psychiatric patients are obsessed with blood, is referred to as Renfield's syndrome. Now, just one last thing on these Irish vampire authors. There's a mystery that I've wanted to solve, and maybe you can help me with. Charles Maturin, Sheridan Le Fanu, Dion Boucicault and Bram Stoker were all Protestants. They were members of the established Church of Ireland. They weren't Catholics. And the first three, Maturin, Le Fanu and Boucicaut, were descendants of French Huguenots, that is, French Protestants who had fled Catholic France, so they had no love for the Catholic Church. And yet their vampire tales are full of Roman Catholic imagery, particularly, of course, Bram Stoker. This idea that it's crucifixes, rosaries, communion wafers that will deal with the vampire, the power of the Catholic Church. Why would Protestant authors write in such a way? Many pious Catholics, however, may have difficulty with the Van Helsing character. After all, he's not a consecrated Catholic priest, and yet he's walking around with a bag of communion wafers, holy communion wafers, and he goes breaking them up, throwing them around on the ground. You know, that could be viewed as blasphemous by many Catholics. Interestingly, the Catholic imagery was played down in the 1931 Bela Lugosi movie, and Anne Rice in her novels, even though she was brought up a Catholic, she really does play down the whole crucifix angle. And of course later on Anne Rice became an atheist as an adult. Okay, well, let's look at how the TV and movie industry has dealt with the vampire and Dracula story. The 1977 BBC movie Dracula is widely regarded as the adaptation that came closest to the book. It's followed by Bram Stoker's Dracula, the 1992 movie that was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Although there's lots of elements of Bram Stoker, there's also a lot of Francis Ford Coppola in there. Of course, there's no obligation on the part of a movie director to stick to the letter of the novel. So, for example, the silent movie Nosferatu in 1922 takes the vampire story but creates a new character, a kind of rat-like figure in Nosferatu. Now, it has to be said that the director of this movie couldn't get the rights to Dracula, so he kind of created a Dracula-esque movie, but it was a triumph of German expressionist cinema. In 1979, the Dracula movie with Frank Langella in the main role was an attempt to kind of make Dracula respectable again, but it took huge liberties with the Bram Stoker novel. Not least, we have Van Helsing killing Mina underground in a cemetery. She's become a vampire, and Mina is his daughter. I should mention that Van Helsing in this film is played by the legendary British actor Laurence Olivier. But I'm not a massive fan of the 1979 movie. It's a bit too bouffon hair for my taste, and more of a romance than a horror movie. And who is the best Dracula actor of all time? Well, undoubtedly Bela Lugosi has to be top of the pile. He really defined what we now know as Dracula. He was a Hungarian actor himself. He gave Dracula that distinctive Hungarian accent and the whole look, something I don't think Bram Stoker ever really conceived of or thought about. But incredibly, even though we think about Dracula as Bela Lugosi with that accent, you know, he only acted in one Dracula movie, one serious one. And in fact, after 1931, he didn't act in another Dracula movie for 17 years until he reprised the role in a comedy film with Abbott and Costello in 1948. A little known fact about Bela Lugosi, and sorry, I do like to share these random facts, was that he had to leave his native Hungary in 1919 because he supported a communist revolution that took place in that country in that year. Now, it was crushed and Lugosi scarpered. He went to the United States and only really achieved fame in his 50s with the Dracula role. The second actor who, you have to say is one of the great Dracula actors is Christopher Lee. Now, he played Dracula in way more movies than Bela Lugosi ever did, but he played Dracula with a British accent and with a slightly kind of urbane British manner. Nevertheless, when people imitate Dracula today, they always do it with the Bela Lugosi voice. But nevertheless, Christopher Lee really made the Dracula role his own. He is the Dracula that we all grew up with in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, of course, there have been heaps of movies and TV series with vampires. I mean, it is It's a monster that just refuses to go away or refuses to stay buried. So we have Castlevania, for example, based on a Japanese video game. And in that one, our heroes are trying to stop Dracula taking over Wallachia. Dracula in this series is, well, he's a little bit angry because his wife has been burned to death as a witch. Then there's the sci-fi series Van Helsing that was first broadcast in 2016, and the main protagonist there is Vanessa Van Helsing, who is a descendant of the original Professor Van Helsing. Now, she's hunting vampires in a world that's been reduced to post-apocalyptic conditions. The Yellowstone caldera has exploded, it's permanent night, ideal for vampires. And well, I have to mention Wesley Snipes and the Blade series because, well, I kind of grew up with them. He plays a character called Eric Cross Brooks, whose mother was infected by a vampire when she was pregnant with him. So he's got a big beef about vampires. But it's interesting because Wesley Snipes is one of several African-American actors, black actors, who've taken on the vampire role and really made it their own. Back in the 1970s, there was even a movie called Dracula, which was part of the so-called blaxploitation genre. This was movies that were directed at African-American audiences where the main protagonist was black. It was really pushing back against racism in Hollywood. Now, if you want to join a Dracula or vampire-based organization, you can always join the Dracula Society, which I believe is on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. The Vampire Empire has existed now for decades, founded by Gene Youngson. The estate of Bram Stoker has a very good website with lots of resources and archive material. And of course there is belalugosi.com, which is all about Bela Lugosi. Well, sunrise is coming, so it looks like I better be going. Until we meet next time, sweet dreams.